The first time I watched Shiki, I remember thinking it was an amazing show with interesting storytelling and a thought-provoking narrative. That was back in 2015. Fast forward to 2020, I'm rewatching the show with one of my roommates, and all I could think was, man, was it always this boring? It starts off as an alright mystery series, but the audience is informed what the cause is within the first few episodes and left to watch all the characters try to figure it out for about half the show. The character designs are also kind of awkward for the dark atmosphere of the story and setting, and while the theme of questioning morality and the value of life is handled pretty well, it just doesn't do enough for the show to actually make it good. Thankfully, there's the soundtrack to keep it alive. To this day, Shiki's soundtrack is one that I can recall quite easily thanks to Takanashi Yasuharu's fantastic music, which I expected no less from considering he also wrote the music for Fairy Tail. Which, is basically the only part about that series that people seem to agree is any good. You may also recognize his work on shows like Naruto, Pretty Cure, Log Horizon, Zombieland Saga, Carnival Phantasm, and, this. But jokes aside, Shiki's soundtrack is one that stands out to me in the same way as something like Kofuku Graffitis, in that both were made for mediocre shows but are absolutely stunning works all on their own. Where Kofuku Graffiti's soundtrack is made to help you relax and get into a comfy atmosphere to match whatever the girls are doing on screen, Shiki's almost seems to do the same thing, but in a way that sends chills down your spine. And how can music be spooky and relaxing at the same time? Simple, just listen and you'll know. This is the main theme of the show, and while that short excerpt might not have been enough to convince you that the music is both calming and unsettling simultaneously, it becomes more apparent with many of the other pieces in the soundtrack. This one introduces most of the common elements that we'll be experiencing throughout the soundtrack, both musically and instrumentation-wise. Harmonically, the music stays in the key of C minor, held steady by an acoustic guitar line that only shifts around to mark the end of each phrase. Simple phrase accents from an Indonesian gamelan ensemble gives the music a slightly otherworldly vibe, unsettling but more meditative than actually scary. The use of this unchanging harmonic line and these slightly unsettling accents is for setting up the atmosphere of the show, in which the rural countryside town of Sotoba is located. Here, life is simple and unchanging until the mysterious Kirishiki family arrives, bringing with them an unsettling aura. As a female soloist breathily sings out a new melody, the harmonies begin to shift a bit, if only so slightly, indicating a change in the atmosphere of Sotoba. The singer begins in C minor, but also throws in a sharp 6, shifting into a C Dorian sound for a moment that brightens the overall mood, if only briefly. This alluring A natural is enticing, drawing us in just enough to make us want to hear it again, ensnaring us much like the vampires in the show. Given how the vampires of Shiki follow the classic vampire rules established in Bram Stoker's Dracula, they rely on cunning and allure more than feats of strength and superhuman abilities. We can hear this in the music's gradually thickening texture, most notably when the Hyeum string soloist leads us into the climax, the vocal line now sung by multiple female singers and a low double bass to shift the chords in a more standard musical way. Given the title of the piece, we can attribute this to being the night portion, in which the vampires that were hidden during the day are free to roam about, enacting their plans to feed on and convert other members of the village. The titles of most of the pieces in the soundtrack don't have much to do with anything in the actual show itself, but they convey a feeling that accurately depicts what we can assume Takanashi envisioned as he was writing the music. This piece is quite clear with the imagery of a pendulum, represented through the boys' choir singing a dissonant chromatic quarter note melody. Children's voices in horror settings are one of the most basic ways to unsettle a viewer or listener, and the unresolving chromatic melody only adds fuel to the fire. Adding to that, while most listeners likely aren't aware, the choir is ever so slightly out of tune, but rather than singing flat like most out-of-tune singers do, the singing is sharp, raising the pitch very slightly in a way that our ears aren't quite used to hearing. This forces the listener to not only perceive that something is wrong, but for untrained ears to not even realize that the music is out of tune, and thus the unsettling nature of the tune is obscured. If we draw a comparison to the show, we can explain the idea of hypnosis through both the pendulum swinging back and forth and the hypnotic trance the human victims of Sotoba are left in after being visited by a vampire. While the vampires don't need to use a pendulum or any sort of natural hypnosis techniques, this allows us to draw a connection to the events of the story as well as explaining why the melodic line is so spooky and chromatic. The music itself, much like the first example, is quick to build into a texturally rich string and full choir ensemble, adding in some taiko hits and an organ to turn the unsettling feeling into an overwhelming menace, mirroring the way day and night represented the vampire's power shift. And just to make sure the track ends as creepily as it began, the ensemble is reduced down to gamelan, organ, and subdued children's laughter right before one big blast from the taiko and full ensemble to close it all out. Of course, not every instance of a show is going to strictly follow the overall atmosphere, as it would leave the viewer feeling either bored or exhausted, and this piece acts as a more, well, simple piece of music. It's hard to describe exactly what the vibe of this track is because it doesn't seem to be characteristic of anything in particular. Not to say that it's not an interesting track, just that it doesn't fit any specific atmosphere or vibe. As before, the gamelan adds an otherworldly element we can attribute to the supernatural beings. More unique here is the use of the overtone singing in the vocal drone, something we can find in quite a few other tracks in the soundtrack as well. Overtone singing is a technique for singers that allows them to sing two pitches simultaneously. Quite obviously, it doesn't sound quite as melodic and traditionally beautiful as regular singing, but the very idea of being able to sing more than one note at a time is incredible in and of itself, not to mention the meditative sound it seems to convey against the contrasting hip-hop beat. This is quickly followed by what I can only describe as scat beatboxing, matching the style of the beat for a vibe that doesn't seem to match the show at all. Yet if we draw some sort of connection, this contrast can be understood through hip-hop's non-combative battle culture, vaguely resembling the battle of wits that takes place leading up to the actual fights later on in the show. I can't recall any particularly specific moments when this track plays throughout the series, but I always seem to associate it with moments where either Ozaki is trying to figure out the best way to counter the vampires, or when Tatsumi is plotting against Ozaki. Considering how these two tend to be at the forefront of the opposing faction, the provocative beat mixed with the otherworldly elements seems only natural to represent their non-violent fights in the first half of the show. This piece is the final one on the soundtrack and ties many of the story's core elements and themes together in a simple yet beautiful piece. Opening with a Gregorian chant-esque rendition of the main theme, the male vocalists are accompanied only by a low drone on the double bass, which strongly establishes our E Dorian key by hardly ever moving to a different note. Gregorian chant is holy music of the church, and thus the relation to the show is hard to miss given that vampires, unholy creatures, have an aversion to it, as well as the religious aspect tied to Seishin, the junior monk. This is an interesting amalgamation of themes, as Japan is not a particularly religious country, and Christianity is especially rare by comparison. Seishin himself is Buddhist, but spends a fair amount of time in the town's church, which Tsunako basically calls a sham, as she would be afraid to go near it otherwise. Despite this, the presence of a church in a story about vampires gives meaning to the church-like music, doubling down as the female choir comes in with an organ, yet another church-like element. Where the really cool mix comes in is with the Crotales replacing the Gamelan. At this point in the series and soundtrack, we've come to understand that the vampires, while still supernatural beings, are not so different from the humans as they were initially presented. This reevaluation of their existence removes the otherworldliness that was encapsulated through the Gamelan's chimes, now replaced with the similar but more familiar sound of Crotales. While Crotales are not East Asian instruments, they are not uncommon in Buddhist settings, typically as finger chimes, and so they capture the unique nature and circumstances of Shiki's vampires. That while there are no Western holy elements to keep them at bay, the nature of the temple and the Eastern ceremonial aspects are just as effective against them. And of course, given the title of the track, this piece of music links the connection to life and death, ultimately walking the same line as those who are undead and asking the question of whether it is the Shiki or the humans that are the true monsters. Shiki is sort of a musical anomaly that manages to balance a wide variety of aspects while still keeping a consistent aesthetic all throughout the show. Whether it's a melancholic piano track or a Buddhist-inspired hip-hop beat, everything seems to match what I would expect from the show while simultaneously managing to surprise me with its use of unconventional ensembles. It's a shame that Takanashi's music tends to go to waste on series that don't live up to his musical abilities, but I'll continue to hold out hope that someday he'll get to work on a production that can do his music justice. And yes, I'm saying his music is too good for Log Horizon. But let me know down in the comments what you guys think of Shiki and its soundtrack, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel for more anime music reviews, and support the channel over on Patreon and by following all my other social media accounts. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.